Welcome to the Convergence podcast. The Convergence team is taking the month of August off for a short break. We're excited to re-air one of our favorite and most practical episodes from season 1, and then we're going to be back in September with a brand new set of episodes on fostering engaged teams who ship delightful products. This week, we revisit our conversation with renowned product expert Josh Seiden on how to build more effective, collaborative, and nimble teams using a customer-centric approach to OKRs. In this episode, Josh, who is the author of Outcomes Over Outputs and co-author of Lean UX, shares his perspective on what needs to be true at an organization to actually benefit from OKRs. We're going to hear about the best practices for writing objectives and key results, and how to lead teams toward disciplined execution to serve your business goals. This discussion also covers the importance of starting small, understanding your why for implementing OKRs, and how this framework, when applied with a focus on human behavior, can foster accountability, alignment, and transparency within your organization. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
The core of customer centricity is, what's the customer trying to do? How can we make it possible for them to do that thing in the way they want, in a way that's easier, better, faster, or in some way creates more value for them?
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, we are joined by Josh Seiden. Josh is a renowned product expert, and him and I share passions in how to build delightful products, as well as how to enable teams to be more customer-centric, more effective, more collaborative, and more nimble. Josh has authored or co-authored a number of books that us lean, agile product nerds are likely familiar with. Books like Lean UX, Sense and Respond, Outcomes Over Outputs, and his latest book, Who Does What by How Much. I checked it out and I found it to be delightfully rooted around customer-centric outcomes and human behavior when implementing OKRs. Josh developed a lot of these opinions when working in product management, product design, and in product coaching. He started a company called Neo that was acquired by Pivotal Labs. And prior to that, he worked in design for the Alan Cooper, who is known as the father of Visual Basic and the author of the product design mandatory reading About Face. He was also on the team that built the Kensington Turbo Mouse. You might remember the big red billiard ball. And if you're like me, you might have salivated over this while window shopping, or may even been lucky enough to own one. Josh now runs a training business with his co-author, Jeff Gothelf, called Sense and Respond, that shares the name with the second book that they wrote together. Today's discussion largely revolves around their latest book and a more customer-centric and human-centric approach to winning at OKRs. OKRs, or Objectives and Key Results, are a goal-setting framework that was introduced by Andy Grove at Intel in the 1970s, and then really popularized by John Doerr after he introduced them at Google in the late 90s. We get to hear Josh's perspective on things like what needs to be true at your organization to gain the promised benefits of OKRs. What are the best practices in writing the O's and the KRs? And how do we best go about leading teams to gain disciplined execution of the OKRs to ultimately serve your business goals? Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. For the OKR nerds out there, make sure to check out also our episodes with Deepika Yeragunta from June 11, 2024, as well as the one with Holly Bilawa in the Agile and Beyond episode from June 24, 2024. Here's Josh.
Today, a lot of what we're going to be talking about is OKRs because of the book you've written and no doubt a deep amount of expertise as well as introspection you've got to do about OKRs. And Maybe let's start at a really high level. Why do you like OKRs compared to a variety of goal-setting frameworks that are out there?
So, I think that a lot of goal-setting frameworks are really like planning frameworks in disguise. They may lay out some sort of high-level vision, but then it's really about what's our plan to get there. And OKRs are a little bit different. OKRs kind of they capture strategy. They say, here's our strategic vision. And then that's the objective, right? Here's our strategic goal. And then the KR, the key result part of OKR, is the measurement. How do we know we've gotten there? And what's really cool about that is that it asks a question, right? It says, here's our goal. This is what we're trying to do. But it doesn't answer it. It doesn't say, here's what we're going to build or here's what we're going to make. And, if you've spent any amount of time in product development or technology, you know that a lot of the ideas that we have at the beginning of a project or an initiative, even for super smart teams, a lot of those ideas don't work. And so, when our goals are set in terms of we're going to build a thing, okay, maybe we build it, maybe we don't, but there's no connection to whether that thing is valuable. Mm-hmm. And OKRs really focus the story on value.
There's no shortage of books or even coaches now on OKRs.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, you decided to add one more book to the mix. And so what inspired that? What did you feel like was different about your take on it?
Yeah, this was a question that so the book, my co-author on the book is Jeff Gothelf, and Jeff and I have written 3 books together. This is our third. And when we started talking about this one, we had some hard conversations about whether or not the world needed another OKR book, because there's a bunch of really good ones out there. And if we were going to write an OKR book, what was our point of view? And as we started to look at it, we realized that the thing that we've been doing and teaching was not really represented in these other books. And that specific thing was this idea of customer centricity, right? How do you put, human behavior, or, we can talk more about this idea of outcomes, but how do we put that customer-centric outcome at the center of OKRs? And so I think that's really what we felt like the world of OKR books was missing, and created an opportunity for us to add something to the conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. No argument there. I've worked at Pivotal Labs myself and got a healthy dose of the importance of customer centricity, human centricity, and regretted a lot of decisions I'd made before that job that didn't necessarily look at things in that perspective. So no argument about adding more customer centricity to everything. That's one thing that I'm happy to paint with a broad brush. When it comes to actually getting into using the framework, tell us a little bit more about how that customer centricity comes into play around defining it and then managing to the OKRs here.
Yeah. Customer centricity is one of those things that nobody's going to disagree with those words. Oh no, we shouldn't be customer centric. Screw the customer, blah, blah, blah. But the trick is in actually doing it, right? What does it mean? And I think a lot of times we mistake that phrase, oh, we're going to be nice to the customer. We're going to be polite. We're going to use please and thank you, or we're going to, paint the room a beautiful color or whatever. And I'm not saying those things are unimportant, but the core of customer centricity is, what's the customer trying to do, right? And how can we enable that behavior? How can we make it possible for them to do that thing in the way they want, in a way that's easier, better, faster, or in some way creates more value for them, and at the same time creates more value for us? And so with that lens, the sort of actionable piece of customer centricity is about customer behavior. What is the customer trying to do? And that's where the name of the book comes from, right? Who does what by how much, right? we say that in an OKR, your objective is a statement of the value you're trying to create for customers. And the KR is a measure of customer behavior, or what we call an outcome. So who's the person? What are they trying to do, right? What's the behavior that we're going to try and create? And by how much? What's the measure of that? So we're going to increase foot traffic in our stores, or we're going to increase daily usage of our product, or something specific and concrete and measurable.
I love that. This also reminds me of the word empowerment. And I don't know if you've ever familiarized yourself with the work of Tom Foster and his books it's around people management, largely, and organizational development. And I was in a workshop with him, and he asked, hey, what is it that great leaders can do for their people? What is it that your people really want? And I said, empowerment. And it's almost like he scapegoated me at this workshop where he's like, and what does that mean exactly? And there was a lot of nebulous sort of follow-up that I had as well as the audience had. And he said, this is all so hard to understand. You barely understand it yourself. It's more of a feeling than something that can be measured. And ultimately, there are two things that you want. You want authority and accountability. You want to make sure folks know what kind of box they're allowed to play in and do whatever they want. And then the second part that you're talking about, which is what by when. And those are the two things that add up to this feeling of empowerment. And at the same time, way more actionable, measurable. As a leader, you can check if you're clarifying accountability and authority that way. And I love it. It seems very aligned there. So speaking of the organization, there are certainly a number of folks, maybe similar to Agile. OKR is a little bit newer, maybe. But what I see similar is a lot of folks look around and give it some sort of shot. And to date, in my experience, it's a minority of companies that are really gaining the most out of OKRs and seeing a team that's more productive, more likely to hit their goals, being more predictive. So what needs to be true in an organization, I think, before OKRs can have a chance at succeeding?
I almost want to start like before the organization and just talk about what we've learned about successful adoptions of OKRs, which is that no one gets it right out of the box, right? We talked to lots and lots of companies in our research for this book, and everybody reported a similar experience, which is that the first implementation, wasn't as successful as they hoped. Now, there were usually germs, seeds of something good there, right? For example, we talked to Infobip. They've been iterating on their OKR process for, more than 5 years, right? And every year they learn something and they make a change, and they learn something and they make a change. And this is a pattern that we saw over and over again. So like one of the things that has to be true at the organizational level is just starting with the understanding that it's a journey and it's going to take time to get right. And so if your organization is an organization that likes and expects and only tolerates sort of silver bullet kind of thinking, this is not for you.
And from a cultural standpoint, if there are leaders out there that are maybe worried about it, they want to change, they don't know what to get started, or know that, hey, you know what, I'm moving away from the silver bullet thinking, what's the advice to the leaders there to foster a better environment where this kind of journey or iterative approach would succeed?
So there's some advice that we give to in the book about getting started. The first is understand your why. Like start with why. Why are we implementing OKRs? There are a lot of things that OKRs can do for an organization, and sort of the way that you the goal there is going to influence the way you implement them. And being able to tell a story about the why is really important for leaders. So being clear, are we trying to create more accountability? Are we trying to create more transparency? Are we trying to create more alignment? Like what's the reason for the tool? That's the first thing. The second thing is start small. and start small with a kind of a stacked deck, right? So we're not going to roll this out to the entire organization in the first iteration. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a pilot team or a pilot group, right? A small number of highly capable people who like change, because our goal is to succeed, right? And so you want to sort of stack the deck and pick places where you're likely to be able to get wins, because you're certainly going to find the obstacles. So you need to get some wins along the way. And so start with why, start small, stack the deck, and then be prepared to sort of iterate with their process as you go.
I love the start small and also stacking the deck. As well as I do during our work at Pivotal, doing kind of large scale enterprise transformation, there were certainly executives that we worked with that would say, no, this is our worst team. If you can fix them, you can fix anyone. And we'd have to kind of work with them around, no, why don't you help us work with your best team that you don't think can't do any better? And if you can make them better, not only do you prove out that this can work, but also you will prove out to everybody else in your organization that it works in-house, so that everyone else has some level of, call it self-efficacy or internal confidence that this isn't just something for LinkedIn and Google and Facebook. It's something that can happen right here at our larger company that isn't necessarily a tech company, right?
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are.
I've spent most of my career working in technology and product development as either a product manager or a designer or a coach working with product teams. And so my interest is really in, how do we put great stuff in the world, and how can teams be more effective, more collaborative, more agile, more aligned to strategy, and more customer and user centric.
Tell us about the different roles or any companies we may have heard of along the way that you got to work at.
If you go way back, the first company I worked at was a company called Kensington. I worked on a product called Turbo Mouse. We made the best trackball in the world, as far as I'm concerned, and that was a cool intro to the industry because I worked on software and hardware and lots of fun stuff. I worked for my first real design job was for a guy named Alan Cooper, who had, I think, a pretty groundbreaking software design studio in Silicon Valley in the 90s, and wrote a book called About Face, which I think every software designer should know. I moved to New York. I worked on Wall Street for a while. I opened a company called Neo. It was a studio that built digital products, and which ultimately we sold to Pivotal Labs. So I'm let's say I'm a fellow traveler with the world of Pivotal Labs.
Going back to your question about the why, and I'm going to maybe have you try and put your designer hat on and do a little bit of sort of qualitative measurement. Things like accountability are maybe hard to measure. And looking back, maybe, a couple of quarters in of doing OKRs, if we want to say like, hey, is this achieving the thing? Is there more of a sense of accountability? What's a way that if you were running a team, you would try and do a comparison to give yourself confidence before you give anyone else confidence that we're on the right track?
One of the things that happens with goal setting is we can come together in a room and we can say, like with your story about empowerment, right? We want to create an empowered team, or we want to create more accountability in the organization. And again, you can't argue with those things, but how do you make them real, right? Well, one way that you can make them real is you can say, when our teams are more accountable, what will they be doing differently, right? And so what are the behaviors associated with highly accountable teams, right? Well, maybe they proactively check in every week. Maybe they set milestones and hit them. Whatever that behavior is. And so when we say we want a more accountable organization, right? When we use OKRs, we're going to be more accountable. What we do with our clients is we say, okay, we're going to write an OKR for our OKR implementation that will tell us that we're actually making progress towards our organizational goals, right? And then we're measuring the behavior that we're seeing in the organization to tell us whether, we're actually making progress on this stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And there's that meta element of getting better at getting better that comes into play here, where you can maybe learn a little bit more about OKRs by having an OKR for the implementation. On the other hand, it could also get really convoluted and overcomplicated, right? Because you've got 2 layers of abstraction you're working on. What's some best practices where if you were to go in and read a team's OKRs, or you're reading your own, you feel like, hey, these are well-defined, well-written, both on the objective as well as the key results? And then what are some maybe cautions around being overly simplistic, or more likely, I think, around our technical folks being overly complicated around going about it?
So there are a couple of kind of, I think, useful guidelines, heuristics, whatever you want to call them. Most teams should have one OKR. Okay. One OKR, single objective, somewhere between 3, 4, maybe 5 key results associated with that one objective. And the idea is that an OKR represents your main area of focus for that time period. It's not 100% of the work you're going to do. So if you're writing an OKR for everything you're doing it wrong, right? Yeah, we've got these other KPIs. Maybe we're responsible for some other part of the business. We've got numbers that we're measuring, but our OKR is our single focus. So that's one rule. The second is the objective inspiring, and is the objective expressing value that we're creating for our customer? We should talk about that word customer in a couple minutes, but is the objective inspiring and creating expressed in terms of where we can see the connection to customer value? And then the third big rule is that the key results, they must be measures of what we call outcomes, right? So measurable changes in human behavior that create value, or who does what by how much, right? So that's the first line of sort of self-check, right, that we recommend is just kind of looking at those 3 rules. And that's hard. Like that by itself, if you get that right, that's a hard starting point.
So before we dig deeper, can you make this just a little bit more tangible with some examples of inspiring, not inspiring, having more than 3 to 5? That one's easier to understand in terms of key results to an objective ratio. So do you have some examples of good versus bad on any of those, or better versus not better?
I'm going to make up an OKR example for you here, but this is a story about Tesla. Okay. And so OKRs express strategy, right? And so strategy is, we have an obstacle to overcome. How are we going to overcome it? And so in the earliest days of Tesla, one of the obstacles that they faced is that electric cars were not perceived as sexy. They were super uncool. They were like nerdy, slow, underperforming vehicles. And so how do you address that challenge? Well, the first car that Tesla worked on was their Roadster. They didn't expect to sell that car, certainly not in any high volume. It was not a high volume production car. It was a car aimed directly at the editors of car magazines. Right? And what they wanted was to change the public perception by having car magazine editors write, enthusiastic stories about how cool this electric Roadster was. Okay. So the objective then, right? The objective might be something inspiring like, make electric cars cool. Right. And so what's the key result, right? And it doesn't say build a Roadster. The objective isn't build a Roadster. And the key result is also not build a Roadster. The objective might be who does what by how much. Get car magazine editors and enthusiasts writing enthusiastic articles about our concept cars, right? In all of the major magazines, at least once per quarter, have car magazine editors feature our Roadster on the cover of top 10 car magazines, 5 of the top 10 car magazines this year, right? So objective, inspiring, make electric transportation cool, right? Key results, who? Magazine editors. Does what? Write, exciting articles, right? About our car. By how much? 5 out of the top 10 magazines cover us enthusiastically.
A very obvious assumption there is that they knew amongst the tens of thousands of things that were really hard for Tesla to do, that making it cool was, for whatever reason, something that they prioritized that quarter or those 6 months or whatever. And there's some level of prioritization there at a business level that provides the stage for everything else to kind of flow a little bit more smooth. And you and I've probably worked at companies that don't have that articulated at the same level of Tesla. So I'm curious about your opinions around articulating strategy.
Yeah, well, so it's an interesting problem when you're writing about OKRs, because OKRs really don't work without a strategy. Right? Now, you may have a strategy that you haven't articulated well, and then OKRs can help you articulate it. But, I've worked with companies that really wanted to do OKRs. They really, they thought, we're really having trouble delivering from quarter to quarter on our commitments. And we really think OKRs are going to help us deliver quarter to quarter. And so when I started working with them, my first question with this particular company that I'm thinking of is, okay, let's articulate the strategy so that we can focus on only the most important things, and we can let all these other commitments kind of move into second priority. And what we discovered was that actually they didn't have a well-articulated strategy. They didn't have a strategy. And so what their problem was not in their goal-setting framework. Their problem was they were always thrashing, because somebody was always barging into the room saying, we need to do X, and we need to do Y, and we need to do Z. And they couldn't agree on their priorities. And if you can't do that, you can't write OKRs. So that starting point of being able to have strategic clarity and strategic discipline, OKRs can help you maintain the discipline, but you need the clarity first.
And do you think, in terms of coming up with that clarity and strategy, there's maybe some level of overcomplication that comes into play when most of the leaders kind of tend to know what's needed?
Absolutely. I mean, strategy is one of those words. I said earlier today with a group of people I was working with, strategy is one of those words that has its own walk-on music. It's like, oh, its strategy is here. You know what I mean? Whereas like, it's just like strategy is an approach to solving a problem. So let's figure out our approach, right? What's the problem and how are we approaching it? And so, I think strategy really can be as simple as what's our biggest obstacle and what's our policy towards approaching that obstacle, right? With the Tesla story, we're going to make electric cars sexy. Their next car was the luxury model, right? Model S. We're going to make them sexy. Then we're going to make them appealing to the market by selling a high-end car that only a few consumers can afford. And then we're going to introduce the mass market, right? And then follow that with a broader appeal, widen out the appeal, fill out the model line, right? But first make it sexy, then make it something that consumers offer, something that high-end consumers want to buy to reinforce that message, and then address the mass market. That's not a complicated notion, right? I mean, look, they have a lot of other problems. They had a lot of other problems, and they've remained a lot of other problems to solving. But in terms of a strategic statement, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and I think we've also seen time and time again that if we can get everyone present in a room, ideally in person, and it's well facilitated and there's the right sort of energy or vulnerability in the room, it's 60 minutes with some sticky notes and clever facilitation, and everyone's going to agree what the top 3 things that need to be solved in the next 3 to 6 months are across the organization, versus needing to go do a study and another study and take 18 months to figure out something that is not going to give you any more information than the first 60 minutes of that expedition. And speaking of leadership, I think different leaders have different ways in terms of how they delegate. And I think you've had some experience with some leaders who have had to figure it out or learn the hard way about what they're good at and what they need their teams to be good at, and the juice in between. So tell us about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways, right, we were just talking about how strategy, when you've got a strategy, people can align to it because it feels really simple and clear. And I think a good leader makes things simple and clear. But I think one of the mistakes that I've seen leaders make sometimes is they make things simple and clear the wrong way. And so instead of, creating a strategy and say, now go, be fruitful and multiply or whatever, they give a direction like build this product. All we need to do is build this product, and once we've built it, we'll win. And so you'll notice, like in the Tesla story, that story was about, the goal there was to make electric cars sexy. It wasn't to build a roadster. Roadster was a means to an end. I worked on Wall Street once for a really successful CEO. He was a serial entrepreneur with 3 successful companies behind him. The business I was working in served stock traders at institutional money managers, so mutual funds and things like that. And so we knew stock traders really well, and we wanted to diversify our product offering. And so stock traders work with portfolio managers. Portfolio managers make the investment decisions. Stock traders execute them, basically. And we didn't really know portfolio managers very well at all. And our CEO had an idea for a product for portfolio managers, and gave my team, I was running design at this company at the time, gave my team the mandate to go design and then lead the construction of this product. And we went out and we started talking to portfolio managers, and we discovered that none of them wanted this product. And so the mission, diversify our product offering, was a good one. Portfolio managers, it's an interesting audience for us. Go out and make this thing for portfolio managers. It was the wrong idea. And so we had to bring that learning back into the organization and bring it back to the CEO and say, they don't want it. And when we were able to create better conversations between the CEO and the other teams in the company and these portfolio managers, we were able to come up with a product that they really did want. that was similar to what the CEO wanted, but it was significantly different. And so what's the point of this story? The point of this story is give the team a problem to solve, right? Which is create a product that portfolio managers will love, rather than build this product, right? And in the first case, that problem to solve, it gives the team the opportunity to engage and find the right answer, right? Rather than just embarking on an execution track that is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and will ultimately fail.
And that notion of leadership highlighting the problems and then the team ideating and validating and iterating on the solutions sounds kind of similar to maybe parallel to who writes the objectives and who writes the key results. And between the teams and the leaders, how do you like that all divvied up?
Yeah. Well, I think that I think a good organization, you've got OKRs at various, what you sometimes hear described as flight levels in the organization, right? So you've got organization-wide OKRs, and then you have OKRs at levels below that, work groups and teams. And so it's important that the OKRs kind of be connected. So you want the team to have an OKR that supports the work group's OKR, and the work group's OKR should support the organization's OKR. The way they get written is through a conversation, top up and bottom down, top down and bottom up. I think in the story that I just told about this Wall Street example, the CEO was right. We needed to diversify our product offerings, and he was right that was a good market. But he was not close to that market personally, and so and that's not because he was bad at his job. It's because as a CEO running this business, it's not his job to be close to every customer and every user, right? You have people in your organization, as the organization grows, whose job it is to be those customer experts. And so his expert is, how do I make the organization successful? And so he needed to have that conversation with the people who were doing the field work, who were developing that daily expertise in customer needs, and they needed the blessing and support of the CEO. So who writes them, you asked me? You write them in conversation, up and down, and you rely on the fact that there's important clarity about different dimensions of the business at every level.
So that's really helpful around that conversation across the organization to make sure that you've got them well written and that the right folks are writing the right parts. Part of this also is around measuring progress, right? Like in different organizations, I think have different habits around how often they check in to see things are, more than anything else, is it on track or off track for this quarter or this amount of time that we've set this OKR for? And what's your preference there if you were to go in and help someone with measuring the progress of their OKRs?
So, in the book, we talk about OKRs being three things. We say they are a goal-setting framework. And so we've been talking about that, right? Objective and key result. The second thing they are is that they're a way of working, a process. And you often hear this process called the OKR cycle. We can talk about the third thing in a moment too, which is that OKRs also are a culture. But your question is really about that process of using OKRs. And so there's a pretty well-established rhythm for using OKRs. You set OKRs at an organizational level annually. You check in quarterly. You check in monthly, and teams should be checking in every week or two. It kind of depends on the team, right? And so that rhythm of frequent, we'll call it every sprint or every week meetings, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual. That's your meeting rhythm that kind of is the OKR cycle. And at each one of those points, you're checking in on progress, and you're checking in with kind of a different group of folks, and kind of different roles.
And any caution or advice in terms of how do we make these meetings and check-ins really productive and energizing versus another status meeting that doesn't necessarily drive any new prioritization or decisions or insights?
Yeah. So they sort of the first rule of thumb is you want most of the meeting to be forward-looking, right? So let's look at the numbers. Let's understand where we are today, right? But most of the meeting is about planning what we're doing next, right? What are we doing next week, right? What are we doing next month? And so it's that's part of it. The second is that it really is, I think people need to understand their roles, right? That OKRs are really, really good for problems where we are working to discover the answer, right? So we always want to be talking about what we've learned, what we're deciding based on what we've learned, and what we need to learn next, right? And I think, if it gets into sort of teams defending what they've done, then we've sort of lost the script. So I think, for a leader in that meeting, it really is, tell me what you've learned in the last week. Let's say, tell me what you've learned in the last month, because that's really where the weekly meetings are for the team. That's it, right? But it's that monthly meeting where we're sort of having a more formal presentation to leadership. The questions around leadership are, what have you learned? What have you decided based on what you've learned? And what do you need to learn next? Right? And then the next question is, how can I help? Right? But that what do we need to learn next is really the focus of the meeting. And I think in some ways, if you've spent any time in the design world, right, the sort of attitude here is that it's a critique, right? We're trying to make the work better, right? We're not trying to hold the team's feet to the fire. We're not trying to, prosecute people, right? We're working together to make the work better. So what do we need to do to make the work better? And what do we need to do? Where's the learning focus for the next period?
And speaking of, I think since we've worked at Pivotal, I'm going to make an assumption that you're also a believer in the benefits of things like pair programming or pairing on the various roles, right? And as opposed to doing pull requests in the case of code. And I think it's a little bit more, to some extent, it's efficient and tactical, but to some extent, it's really a philosophy articulation where, as opposed to doing a pull request, which might be a little bit more on the command and control side, you're putting the accountability and the empowerment closer to the work. And I'm curious when it comes to OKRs, if you've got any thoughts on peer review within the team or peer review across teams versus management to the teams.
So, I will say, like, my work on this got started, more than 10 years ago now. Jeff and I wrote our first book together, which is a book called Lean UX. And it was trying to solve the problem of how teams, not just UX people, but designers, product people, technologists, how they could work together in an Agile context to make great products. And so the starting point there was team cross-functional collaboration. We're making these decisions together, right? This isn't a product manager writing stories and everybody picking up tickets, right? This is a team making plans and executing together. The feedback that we got from that book was sort of overwhelming feedback was, look, we like the idea of working this way. Folks, I think it was generally met with a really positive reception. And people said, there are things that you write about in this book that we can change as individual contributors, as teams, things that we control as teams. But there are things that we don't control in the organization, right? And so we can be more agile as a team, we can be leaner as a team, but our organization isn't agile and lean, right? And so there's only so much we can do. And so one of the questions that we've been looking for is, how do we systematize this way of thinking, collaborative, cross-functional, right? Oriented around continuous learning and improvement. How do we make a system like that that's not just for technology product teams, but is for whole organizations? And I think in OKRs, we have a system like that. And so kind of baked into our philosophy is this approach that you're talking about, which is that it's not about command and control. It's about collaboration. It's about bringing minds together, right? So this isn't, my boss writes the OKR and then I do it, right? This is, as a team, we have a conversation with leadership, right? We understand what's important to leadership because they've written an OKR for themselves, right? And then we look at that OKR and we say, how can we as a team best support that? And we have that conversation with our leaders, right? We think the best way we can support that is X. What do you think, right? You have a two-way conversation, and then you kind of ratify that, right? And then you say, okay, good. Now we've got our marching orders. This is your OKR, and this is how we're going to support it, right? And I think it's a viable alternative to command and control that maintains accountability, it maintains alignment, and if you do it right with this rhythm of check-ins, you're also creating transparency.
And something that I think really can act as a really great lubricant, but also fairly sophisticated, is our ability to predict, right? How often are we hitting them? How many of the key results did we hit in service of this objective? And I think it's just human nature where if there are teams that tend to more likely hit their goals, we tend to have more trust in them. That all being said, estimation's really hard, and a system where we kind of lose track of the plot. There may be teams out there that are hitting their goals, but not necessarily doing it in this true spirit of how the goals were meant to be written. And in terms of overall outcomes, they're not necessarily winning, but the leading indicators pointed us to the other way. And so what's your take on this estimation and predictability that OKRs very much are rooted around it?
Yeah. So, maybe I have two things, or two big sort of ideas to share here. The first is measuring things is hard in organizations. Measuring, right? We say that our measures are human behavior. And it's often the case that we don't have good measures of what people are doing, right? And so being able to build those data systems for collecting all the kind of data that we need in order to run this system, that's actually a really big challenge. It's a big hurdle for adopting this. And it's part of the reason why OKRs take time to implement well. Because one of the things you're going to learn in that first iteration is, this is an important thing that we want to measure, and we don't have a way to do that yet. So how do we start to build infrastructure for measuring whatever this important thing is, right? Usually in the first couple of instances, you can figure out proxy measures or other ways to measure. But so that's the first thing, is that access to data becomes like a really first-class problem. The second thing is you want to try and pay attention to where and how there are incentives to kind of game the system. And you want to take that out of the system, right? So you don't want to tie OKR performance to compensation, for example, right? Because then that starts to introduce all kinds of financial incentives that mess up the spirit of the OKR, which is that this is a way for the team to genuinely learn and get better, as opposed to a way for the team to get paid, right? And I'm not saying that getting paid is unimportant, right? I'm just saying that those things influence each other in complex ways.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, to your point, it is something that is super important as much as it becomes really complicated when it's tied back to the incentives. If you were leading a team, I imagine, if someone was routinely hitting their OKRs and doing it genuinely in service of the organization, and your team was better, the company was better, would you argue that that person gets paid more? And what is another way to maybe incorporate these data points, even if it's not a direct math formula that gets applied to what their bonus is?
I mean, I would say, first of all, that there are some hard rules, which is don't have individual OKRs, right? So only team level OKRs. Okay. The second thing is, don't tie the compensation to team's performance against the OKR, because then you're going to encourage them to sandbag, and so I think you tie team performance to the real value that they're creating in the business. And, as a leader, you have to evaluate that, but I don't think you do it formulaically with some kind of spreadsheet that ties OKR performance to financial compensation.
Yeah, it's maybe one of the various components that's factored in as that evaluation comes into play. Of course, some roles it's easier than others. If you're running a sales team and it's extremely quantifiable, it's very different than much more sophisticated work of discerning the value from a product team. You mentioned the word sandbagging. I'll let you finish. Sounds like you had a thought about that, and I'm going to come back.
Well,
to
just in like in complex organizations or in for big products, right? How do you it may be that like I work on a team that's responsible for authentication, right? Like, okay, we do a great job, right? What's the relationship between a great authentication flow and the product success? It's unquestionably important, right? But how do I write a formula for that? Right? I don't think I can, And so digital products, or really most products and services that we offer, they're so interconnected that I just think we want to acknowledge that, right? That it's
Makes a lot of sense. So I want to come back. You mentioned the word sandbagging. I think the original theory and framework suggested, I believe, 80% of the key results being achieved in order to call it a win. I've heard organizations use anywhere from 70 to 90%. Some want 100. Curious if you have any opinions on that.
Yeah, so I think that idea of scoring our OKRs is useful for helping us improve the system, right? So we hit 80% of our OKR. Okay, we consistently hit 80% of our OKR, and last quarter we hit 40% of our OKR, right? What does that mean? Right? Like there's a signal in there that something is different and we need to pay attention. What does it mean? Does it mean suddenly we started doing a bad job, or that we got something wrong? Or like it's a question that I would want to put to the team. What was different about this quarter than last quarter? Yeah, so I think scoring OKRs are really important for diagnostics, for self-assessment, for continuing to improve our OKR implementation. And I think that's the most useful. And because of that, it means that, set up a scoring system that works for you and your organization, and then stick with it over time so that you can use it to compare quarter over quarter, year over year.
And this reminds me of, as you talk about your time at Kensington working on a combination of hardware and software, it's a lot more coordination and integration across the various work streams that needs to come into play, where I'll call it the implication of being wrong about getting something done within a certain time frame goes up tremendously, because it's harder to be malleable around hardware components, maybe, or firmware than it is making sort of high level code changes that we tend to do a lot more nowadays. And so I'm guessing you got introduced to OKR after you worked at Kensington, reading between the lines. But looking back, like, anything specific to companies that are doing IoT or hardware software solutions where OKRs may be nuanced or different?
Well, I think that this sort of gives me an opportunity to talk about this idea of customer. And, what do we mean when we say we want to be customer-centric in our OKRs? We almost called this book Everybody Has a Customer. And so when I think about customers, I would say that the challenge for people is, well, I work in a part of the business that doesn't have customers, right? We don't talk to the person who signs the check. We don't talk to the person who puts the $5 bill on the counter. We don't talk to the person who walks into the store and puts down their money to buy a trackball, right? But in your role, wherever you work in the business, you have a customer. There's another person who directly consumes your work, right? So the industrial designers, their customers are the product managers, right? The people who are designing the mouse enclosure. Their customers are the product managers or the mechanical engineers. So how can I do a great job as an industrial designer, right? I mean, I need to keep the end customer in mind, but I've also got all these internal people whose work my work is consumed by. So my work, to come back to your question about integration, right? If I'm going to coordinate the manufacturing of a complex piece of machinery, right? I've got to think about, well, if I'm the designer, how is my work consumed? How do I make it easy for that person to consume it? How do I make it easy for them to communicate changes back to me? Can we do revisions quickly, right? Whatever the sort of markers are of good process, of good, I'm going to call it customer-centric process, to make that integration easier, right, I'm going to do. And so, I think when we kind of open up our thinking about who is my customer, right? I'm sitting at this desk, who is my customer, right? That opens up a world of possibility for us in terms of the way we set our goals.
Makes a ton of sense. By the way, what I assume when you say the Kensington trackball, it's the famous red ball that we kind of remember. And what makes the best trackball in the world?
Well, the Kensington one was the one that had that big billiard ball sized ball in the middle of it. And so it was super reliable. It felt really good. People liked it because it had that the big ball, billiard-sized ball in the middle of it. It was really comfortable to use. It was super reliable, and it was very precise. And it was for a lot of people who got repetitive strain injury when they were using a mouse, it reduced the risk of that. So.
Cool. I mean, it's hard to sometimes even realize as the user something that just gives you that resonance for something that just feels so satisfying. Like it works like you expected it to work without that sort of human machine interface even. And I'm curious, behind the scenes, what do you think kind of led to that that really intuitive product?
In those days, now everything is integrated, and so if you buy there are no more mechanical mice, but there was no standard mouse in those days. And so everybody built their own mouse out of different kinds of hardware. And that thing was built out of skateboard. It had skateboard bearings in it. The ball sat on top of these big sealed skateboard bearings. And it had a billiard ball. I mean, it's crazy and crazily expensive, those components. And so, over time, people started figuring out less expensive ways to build these things until now, we ended up with these sort of optical mice. But I think, it was just in those days, it was mechanical engineers and industrial designers playing around with stuff that felt good,
Yeah, for sure. That's a great story. Tell us a little bit more about the books you've written. So you mentioned Lean UX was the other one, and what's the third?
So Jeff and I wrote a second book after Lean UX called Sense and Respond. which has become the name of our training business. And Sense and Respond was written in response to that feedback that we got from Lean UX readers. They said, look, we want to work in an organization where we can implement these ideas. And would you please write a book that explains this stuff to our bosses? And so we tried to do that. In fact, our original mission was to write a book about Agile that didn't use the word Agile. We were fortunate to I think, reach a good audience. We published that on HBR Press. And so we got the business reader for that one. And then I wrote a book by myself after that called Outcomes Over Output, which was exploring this idea of, really what is an outcome. It was sort of written after I'd hit on this formulation in my consulting work of this notion of an outcome being a valuable change in human behavior, valuable and measurable change in human behavior. And so that's a little book that's all about that idea. And then this book was sort of the natural extension, which is, okay, how do we now build a system around these ideas that applies beyond just digital product teams and to really any kind of organization and organizations of really any size.
Awesome. So you got Lean UX, Sense and Respond, Outcomes and Outputs, and the latest one, Who Does What by How Much. What's the best place for folks to find these?
OKR-book.com. And you'll find links to all of your favorite resellers for Who Does What by How Much.
And we'll make sure to have links in the show notes to how folks can find your books as well as yourself. One question that I like to end the interviews with is around a product that you recently interacted with or service that just totally blew your socks off, gave you that feeling of complete delight. And I'll take an answer from home or work or both.
I recently had the opportunity to install a set of office shelves in not in this office, in another office that I work in, and they're made by a company called Vitsoe, Vitsoe, and they were designed by a famous designer named Dieter Rams, and they are an absolute delight. From the shopping process to the I'm marginally handy person. I'm not a particularly handy person, but the shelves show up. They come with an incredible set of tools for installing them. They're incredibly satisfying and easy to install, and they look beautiful when they're done. So just one of these products where you just feel like every single detail was beautifully considered.
Yeah, I have some experience with the Vitsoe shelves myself. I think I've called it organizational porn, just how the level of detail that they go into, including, did you have them mock-up designs for you? Like you can send a photograph of the wall you want to go it on, and they'll send you back they'll have a human get involved and give you some ideas in terms of which combination of shelves to use.
It's I like to use it as an example for designers of designing for the life cycle, right? Because what you describe, right, there's a component of this purchase which is a service design problem, right? You go to the website, you start to make your inquiry, and you get assigned to a human planner. And so you work with this planner back and forth. You go through this process that you describe where they actually design the system for you, right? And then you buy, once you're satisfied, you go back to the website and you click buy, and then, they're building them to order. So it takes a while for them to show up. But then when they get there, they come with, one of the most delightful things is the shelves only come in 2 widths. And what's the problem of installing shelves? You have to make sure they're level, right? So they come with this measurement tool with a built-in level, right? It's custom designed to fit their shelving system. And it's just,
And no doubt also just so much more inspiring, especially for a workspace, to have something designed by Dieter Rams around to help inspire the work that you're doing that day, right? Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, hey man, thank you so much for making the time. It's awesome for us to get to catch up again and hear about OKRs and the other work that you're doing. Appreciate it a lot.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to talk. So thanks for having me on the show.
Something that Josh and I got to talk about was losing track of the plot. And by that, I meant we sometimes get really engrossed in something we're doing today, and we forget why we're doing it in the first place. This is something that I find to be extremely important, both on a professional as well as a personal level. On our product teams, we're often trying to optimize our efficiency, whether it's implementing lean, agile, OKRs, or whatever process or framework that you think might help. And I think we can really get caught up in trying to do it really well. Say SAFe or scaled agile framework. And I think there can be a lot of wasted effort and energy that goes into perfecting your SAFe implementation based on what the framework guidelines, rather than pausing, I think, and making sure that we ourselves and the teams that we lead understand why we're doing this, like SAFe, what benefits we can expect from successful implementation, and what behavior changes we'll see amongst our product teams and our customers, and how it ultimately helps our business. And I think there's a few risks if you lose track of the plot. Firstly, I think if we're really busy trying to implement a framework, especially across a large organization, this can take a lot of investment in time and money before you see the results. And this can get difficult to justify to business leaders when they don't see the business outcomes, but they're paying the bills and the investments from your budgets, and end up jeopardizing your transformation efforts that might die on the vine before they see the day of light. Instead, I would much rather advise that you relate that why loud and clear and share it with your business leaders and share it with your product teams so that everyone is best enabled to serve this initiative in service of the business versus serving the framework. I promise you'd much rather win at delighting your customers or growing your business than getting some kind of Boy Scout badge that says you implemented SAFe correctly, even if it doesn't necessarily move the needle on building a better team, a better product, or a better business. Another risk is around team engagement. I'd be willing to bet that a lot more folks on your team will be excited about doing things on their day-to-day and week-to-week when you can tie those activities back to how this improves the lives of your customers, makes the world a better place, or helps build your business. And this is as opposed to folks who care about how precisely you implemented your SAFe at your organization and focus way too much on the framework and lose track of this plot and the overall reasons that you started here. And I think this creates a lot of confusion and uncertainty rather than clarity and confidence that can ultimately unlock the collective creativity on your team. A book that has really shaped my perspective on this is called The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt. It's a book on operations and theory of constraints that was written in a fiction format. And I probably reread it every couple of years as I need help crystallizing the underlying why of the business we're building, the customers we're serving, or even on a more personal level about why I'm prioritizing my time over one thing over another. And the last thing I think is that if you can't tie the implementation of the framework back to the underlying reason why you've chosen that framework and what you expect to happen in terms of behavior change, it also becomes really hard to pick those places like Josh talked about with stacking the deck, because it's hard to measure where the most meaningful business outcome can happen if you were to do this thing correctly. So check out the book, The Goal, as well as the books written by Josh and his co-authors. Thank you for listening. Check the show notes for links to all of that. And we will see you here at our next episode that goes out next Tuesday. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.
In those days, we had the back cover of Macworld magazine was where we advertised the Kensington trackball.
What's the circa time frame here?
So I worked there from 1990 to 1996. Okay. We had a copywriter on April Fool's send us a mock-up ad that said, it showed a picture of the trackball and the big ball in the middle of it. It said, "Big, comfortable balls."